The hospital was unusually quiet that night, a stark contrast to the usual hum of machines and muffled cries echoing through the halls. Nurse Carla tightened her grip on the clipboard as she began her rounds. She had worked plenty of night shifts before, but tonight felt different, heavy, as if the air itself was watching her. Room 309 was her first stop, a private room occupied by an elderly man named Mr. Ellison. He had been in and out of consciousness since his admission, his frail body a shadow of its former self. When Carla stepped into the room, the overhead light flickered faintly. She glanced at Mr. Ellison and froze. His eyes, usually closed and sunken, were wide open, staring at the ceiling. His lips trembled, forming silent words. "Mr. Ellison?" Carla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She approached his bedside cautiously, her pulse quickening. His lips moved faster now, the faintest sound escaping, a guttural, repetitive chant in a language she didn't recognize. She reached for his wrist to check his pulse, but the moment her fingers brushed his skin, he grabbed her arm with surprising strength. His eyes locked onto hers, and he croaked, "They're coming. Don't let them in." "Who's coming?" Carla asked, trying to free her arm. But Mr. Ellison's grip was ironclad, his gaze desperate and wild. "The ones who wait in the dark," he rasped before his body went limp. The heart monitor let out a steady tone, signaling he was gone. Carla stumbled back, her breath hitching. She hit the call button, summoning the crash team. Moments later, a flurry of doctors and nurses poured into the room, but it was too late. As they worked to resuscitate him, Carla stepped out into the hallway, her hands trembling. She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, wide with fear, as if he'd seen something beyond the veil of life. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Carla tried to focus on her tasks, but an unease lingered. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Around 3 a.m., she heard it, a soft knock coming from the supply closet at the end of the hall. She froze, her mind racing. It was a single knock, deliberate and measured. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. No response. Summoning her courage, Carla walked toward the closet. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. She reached the door and paused, her hand hovering over the handle. Another knock, louder this time. She flung the door open, but the closet was empty. Rows of neatly stacked linens and medical supplies greeted her. She exhaled shakily, laughing at her own paranoia, but as she turned to leave, she saw it. A shadow standing at the far end of the hall. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured. It stood motionless, its head tilted as if studying her. "Who's there?" Carla demanded, her voice cracking. The shadow didn't move. She took a step back, her heart pounding. When she blinked, it was gone. The rest of the shift was a blur. Carla avoided the hallway, sticking close to the nurse's station, her eyes darting to every dark corner. When morning finally came, she grabbed her things and rushed to leave, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As she passed the front desk, the receptionist called out, "Hey, Carla, you dropped this." She held up Carla's clipboard. Carla frowned. "I didn't drop it," the receptionist shrugged. "Well, it was in the lobby. Weird, huh?" Carla took the clipboard and froze. Scribbled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "They're here." That was Carla's last night shift at the hospital. No one believed her when she tried to explain what had happened. She left her job and never looked back, but the shadow never left her. To this day, she wakes up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain she can feel it watching her from the corner of the room.
Story number 2.
The mortuary technician's job was straightforward. Peter had worked the night shift for years, embalming bodies, preparing them for their final farewells. Death didn't scare him. He had grown numb to the sight of pale skin, sunken eyes, and lifeless expressions. But there was something about Room C that always unsettled him. Room C was where the bodies were stored before preparation. It wasn't the bodies themselves that bothered him. He'd seen too many to count. It was the stories whispered by his colleagues. They spoke of strange occurrences, drawers sliding open on their own, faint whispers, and the sensation of being watched. Peter dismissed it as overactive imaginations fueled by fatigue, until one night. It was a cold November evening, and the mortuary was quieter than usual. Peter was alone, as always, his only companions the steady hum of the refrigeration units and the faint scent of antiseptic. He had just finished prepping a body when the lights in room C flickered. He glanced up, annoyed. The building was old, prone to electrical issues, but the timing felt unnervingly precise. He brushed it off and walked into room C to retrieve the next body. The air was colder than usual, biting at his skin despite his thick lab coat. He scanned the metal drawers, searching for the number assigned to his next case, 217. Finding it, he reached for the handle, but before he could pull it open, the drawer slid out on its own. Peter stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The drawer stopped halfway, revealing the corpse of an elderly woman. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, but her mouth was slightly open, as if frozen mid-sentence. He laughed nervously. "Air pressure," he muttered to himself, though his voice wavered. He grabbed the gurney and began transferring the body, his hands shaking slightly. As he worked, he heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." Peter froze. He looked around the room, his heart pounding. The refrigeration units hummed steadily, their low buzz the only sound. He shook his head, convinced it was his imagination, and finished placing the body on the gurney. As he wheeled it out, the lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Peter cursed under his breath, fumbling for his phone to use as a flashlight. When he turned it on, the beam illuminated the far end of the room. And that's when he saw them. The bodies in the drawers, their pale faces barely visible through the small openings, were moving. Their heads turned slowly, their hollow eyes staring directly at him. Peter's breath hitched as one of the bodies, a man with a stitched-up chest, began to sit up. "Nope, no," Peter muttered, backing toward the door. His flashlight shook, the beam darting wildly around the room. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, his palms slick with sweat, but it was as if the door had been locked from the outside. "Help me," the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the bodies. It was coming from the elderly woman on the gurney. Peter turned, his chest tightening. The woman's head lolled toward him, her mouth moving slowly. "Help me," she repeated, her voice a dry rasp. What do you want?" Peter stammered, his back pressed against the unyielding door. "They won't let me go," she whispered, tears streaming from her sunken eyes. Her hand twitched, slowly lifting toward him. Before Peter could react, the lights flickered back on, blindingly bright. The room was silent. The drawers were all closed, the bodies motionless. The woman lay still on the gurney, her face serene, back her hand resting at her side. Peter didn't wait to find out if it was over. He left the gurney in the hallway and ran straight to the break room, grabbing his keys and jacket. He didn't clock out, didn't lock up, he simply left, speeding away from the mortuary into the night. He never returned to work. Weeks later, when a former colleague called to check on him, Peter asked about the woman in drawer 217. The line went silent before the voice on the other end replied, "There is no 217, that drawer's been empty for years."
Story number 3.
The town's small gas station stood on a lonely stretch of highway, its flickering neon sign casting weak light onto the cracked asphalt. Todd worked the graveyard shift, a boring gig but one that paid the bills. Most nights were quiet, interrupted only by the occasional trucker or late-night traveler. But this night was different. At around 1:45 a.m., as Todd idly flipped through an old magazine, the station's bell dinged. He looked up at the security camera monitor to see a car pulling into the lot. A beat-up sedan, the kind that looked like it belonged to the 90s, rolled to a stop by Pump 3. Todd waited for the driver to step out, but no one did. The car idled, its headlights cutting through the dark. Todd squinted at the grainy black and white screen. Something wasn't right. The car was empty. He leaned closer to the monitor. The driver's seat was vacant. The engine was running, but no one had stepped out to pump gas. Uneasy, Todd grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The air was colder than it should have been for late spring, and a faint mist clung to the ground. He approached the sedan cautiously, calling out, "Hello? You need help?" No response. He shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. The keys dangled in the ignition, the radio playing faint static. A stale, metallic odor wafted from the slightly open window. Todd's stomach churned as he noticed something. The seats were wet, not with water, but with a dark, viscous liquid. "Okay. Nope," he muttered, backing away toward the station. Before he could take another step, the sedan's headlights shut off. The engine cut out. The night fell silent. Todd's heart raced. He turned and bolted back inside, locking the door behind him. He watched the car from the safety of the station, his eyes glued to the monitor. The sedan didn't move for several minutes. Then, the passenger door creaked open. A figure stepped out, shrouded in shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs angular and wrong. Its head tilted as it stood by the car, as if it were listening. Slowly, it began to move toward the gas station. Todd scrambled to reach for the phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. "There's someone outside my station," he stammered. The lights in the station flickered and went out. The line crackled with static before going dead. Todd's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he fumbled for his flashlight. When he clicked it on, the beam illuminated the store shelves, casting long, trembling shadows. A soft tap came from the glass door. Todd turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The figure stood just outside, its face pressed against the glass. Except, it didn't have a face. Its features were smooth, a blank canvas where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The thing tilted its head as if curious. Then it raised a hand, its long fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Todd stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The glass began to crack, thin spiderweb fractures spreading outward. Suddenly, the station's neon lights buzzed back on, flooding the room with harsh light. Todd blinked, and the figure was gone. The glass door was intact, no sign of the cracks that had spread moments before. The sedan was gone too, leaving no trace behind. Todd didn't question his luck. He grabbed his keys and fled the station, leaving everything behind. He drove until the sun rose, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. A week later, the gas station owner called, furious about Todd abandoning his post. But it wasn't the angry voicemail that unnerved him. It was the owner's final words. "We checked the security tapes, and there's nothing there, Todd. No car, no figure. Just you, standing at the door, talking to no one."
Story number 4.
Maggie had been a caretaker at the old Willowcrest Asylum for nearly 3 years. The asylum had been shut down decades ago, but a wealthy family had bought the building and turned it into a private rehabilitation center. Maggie's job was simple: oversee the night shift and ensure the patients stayed safe. Most nights were uneventful, but the third floor, that was a different story. The third floor had been sealed off since the asylum's original closing. Rumors swirled among staff about why. Some said a fire had claimed several patients' lives. Others whispered about inhumane experiments conducted by a deranged doctor. Whatever the reason, the doors remained locked, and Maggie avoided them until the night she didn't. It started with the alarm system. Around 2 a.m., Maggie was in the break room sipping coffee when the sound of a motion alert buzzed from her tablet. She frowned and opened the feed. The alert was coming from the third floor. Her stomach tightened. "That can't be right," she muttered. The cameras on the third floor were mostly for show. The floor was abandoned, no electricity, no occupants. The feed should have been nothing but darkness. Instead, she saw movement. The image was grainy, but a figure was visible at the end of the hallway, a woman in a white hospital gown, her long hair matted and stringy. She stood motionless, facing the camera, her head tilted slightly downward. Maggie's hands trembled as she switched to another camera angle. The woman didn't move, but seemed to be staring directly into the lens, her face partially obscured by her hair. "Who the hell?" Maggie grabbed her flashlight and keys, her heart pounding. She told herself it had to be a glitch or, at worst, a prank by one of the other staff members. She radioed security, but no one answered. Reluctantly, Maggie made her way to the third floor. The air grew colder as she climbed the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When she reached the top, the heavy double doors loomed before her, their chipped paint and rusted hinges a stark reminder of how long the floor had been abandoned. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, tinged with mildew and something metallic. Her footsteps echoed as she walked down the hall, her flashlight casting long shadows against the peeling walls. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. "Is anyone here?" Silence. She checked the rooms one by one, each more decrepit than the last. Dusty gurneys, overturned chairs, and scattered medical equipment littered the space. Room 304 was the last one. The door was ajar, and a faint rhythmic tapping sound came from within. Maggie pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty except for an old wheelchair in the corner. It rocked gently as if someone had just been sitting in it. Her flashlight flickered. She cursed under her breath, slapping it to bring it back to life. When the beam steadied, she froze. The woman from the camera stood in the far corner of the room, her back to Maggie. Her gown was filthy, stained with dark streaks that Maggie didn't want to think about. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here," Maggie said, her voice cracking. She took a cautious step forward. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, her head twisted unnaturally, turning almost 180 degrees to face Maggie. Her eyes were black pits, her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Maggie screamed, dropping her flashlight. In the dark, she heard the woman's voice, a guttural, distorted whisper. "They never left, and neither will you." The door slammed shut behind her. Maggie fumbled for the flashlight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she turned it on, the room was empty. No woman, no wheelchair, just silence. She ran out, not stopping until she was back in the break room. The rest of the night passed in terrified vigilance, her eyes glued to the security monitors. The third-floor cameras now showed nothing but static. The next morning, Maggie handed in her resignation. She never set foot in Willowcrest again. Months later, she received a call from a former colleague. "Weird thing," the voice said. They reopened the third floor for cleaning, found some old patient files. Guess what? There was a woman there who looked just like you described. She was a patient in 1954. Died in her room, room 304. Maggie hung up and never answered another call from the asylum. But she still wakes up some nights, hearing faint tapping outside her bedroom door.
Story number 5.
The old roadside motel was practically deserted, sitting on the edge of a long stretch of forest. Mark had only taken the night clerk job to make ends meet, but from the moment he started, the place gave him the creeps. The wood-paneled walls, dim yellow lighting, and sagging furniture felt like a relic from another era, a time better left forgotten. Most nights, the only sound was the hum of the vending machine and the occasional car pulling in. But one night, around 3 a.m., Mark noticed something strange. Room 6's light was on. He frowned. He hadn't checked anyone into Room 6 that night, or for the past 3 nights. The room had been listed as out of service due to a leaky ceiling. The last guest had left a scathing review about hearing noises all night, scratching, shuffling, and whispers. Maintenance claimed it was just raccoons in the attic, but Mark wasn't so sure. He grabbed the keys from behind the desk and stepped outside. The cold night air bit at his skin as he walked toward Room 6. The light inside flickered as he approached, casting shifting shadows on the drawn curtains. Mark hesitated. He peered through the window, but the thick, yellowed curtains obscured the view. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room smelled damp and stale. The flickering bedside lamp cast an eerie glow over the disheveled bed and worn carpet. At first glance, it looked empty. Mark stepped inside, scanning the room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. "Is someone here?" No response. He moved further in, checking the bathroom. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Empty. But when he turned to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The closet door was slightly ajar. He was certain it had been closed when he entered. A faint scratching sound came from within, so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Look, if someone's in there, you need to leave," Mark said, his voice trembling. "I'll call the cops." No answer. The scratching stopped. Mark reached out with a shaking hand and yanked the closet door open. Empty. Just an old wooden hanger dangling from the rod. He exhaled sharply, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Get it together, Mark," he muttered, stepping back into the main room. But as he turned toward the door, he froze. Someone was sitting on the bed. It was a woman, her back to him, her long, dark hair cascading down a tattered white dress. She was rocking back and forth, her movements slow and deliberate. "Ma'am?" Mark croaked, his voice barely audible. You can't be in here." The woman stopped rocking. Slowly she turned her head, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale and hollow, but her eyes sunken black pits. Her lips curled into a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide. "You shouldn't have come in," she whispered, her voice low and guttural. Mark stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out. He bolted for the door, slamming it behind him and sprinting back to the office. His heart hammered in his chest as he locked the door and grabbed the phone. But when he looked at the monitor for the room cameras, Room 6 was dark. No light. No one inside. Mark quit the next morning. A week later, he heard from a coworker that the motel had been shut down. Apparently, it had been built on the site of an old boarding house, one that had burned down decades ago under mysterious circumstances. The fire had claimed several lives, including a woman in a white dress. To this day, Mark refuses to talk about that night. But sometimes, when he drives past the abandoned motel, he swears he can see a light flickering in room 6.
Story number 6.
The rain hammered down in relentless sheets as Emma drove down the desolate back road. Her GPS had long since lost signal, and the glowing screen now displayed a mocking, recalculating message. It was nearing midnight, and the towering trees that lined the road seemed to close in with every mile. Just as her anxiety peaked, she spotted it. A gas station. Its neon open 24 hours sign buzzed faintly in the storm. Relieved, Emma pulled into the lot, her tires splashing through puddles. The place was eerily quiet, the parking lot empty except for a single beat-up pickup truck. The station's interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering intermittently. Behind the counter sat a man in his late 50s, his face gaunt and pale. He watched Emma with unblinking eyes as she stepped inside, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum. "Evening," Emma said, forcing a smile. "Can you tell me how far I am from the highway?" The man didn't respond right away. His gaze lingered on her, uncomfortably intense. Finally, he said in a low, gravelly voice, "Not far. About 15 miles. But you shouldn't be driving out there tonight." Emma frowned. "Why not?" The man leaned forward, his elbows on the counter. "Storm's bad, and these roads, they're not always safe after dark." Emma tried to laugh it off. "I think I'll be okay. Thanks for the concern, though." The man said nothing more. But as Emma grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, she noticed something strange. The shelves were mostly empty, their contents long expired. Dust coated the packages, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Uneasy, Emma placed the water on the counter. The man rang it up silently, his eyes still fixed on her. As she handed him cash, she noticed his hands, long, thin fingers with nails that looked unnaturally sharp. "Drive carefully," he murmured as she left. Back in her car, Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She shook it off and started the engine, pulling back onto the road. The rain hadn't let up, and the narrow path seemed even darker than before. She kept her headlights on high, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. 10 minutes later, she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Emma slammed on the brakes, her car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, her back turned, wearing a tattered black dress. Her hair hung in stringy, wet strands, plastered to her back. Emma rolled down her window a crack. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Emma honked her horn, but the woman remained motionless. Her guts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't just drive away without making sure the woman was safe. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out of the car. "Ma'am?" Emma called, inching closer. The woman moved, her head tilted, slowly turning to face Emma. Emma froze. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and blank, her mouth stretched into a hideous, unnatural grin. Water dripped from her chin as she took a step forward. Emma stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. "Stay back!" she shouted, but the woman kept advancing, her movements jerky and inhuman. Panicking, Emma bolted back to her car and slammed the door shut. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking violently. The woman was closer now, her face pressed against the driver's side window. Her grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The engine roared to life, and Emma floored it. The woman didn't move as the car sped past her, but when Emma glanced in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. The woman had vanished. Emma's heart pounded as she drove faster, the rain blurring her vision. Finally, she saw the faint glow of headlights ahead. Another car. Relief flooded her as she caught up, flashing her high beams to signal she wasn't alone. But when she got closer, her blood ran cold. It was the beat-up pickup truck from the gas station. The driver's face was obscured by the rain, but Emma could see his hand resting on the steering wheel. Long, thin fingers with unnaturally sharp nails. The truck's taillights flickered, and then it disappeared, vanishing into the night as if it had never been there. Emma didn't stop driving until she reached the highway. When she finally pulled over at a rest stop, her body trembling, she checked her phone. The screen still read, "Recalculating." The next day, Emma looked up the gas station, hoping to find an explanation for what she'd seen. But there was nothing. No listing, no reviews, no sign it had ever existed. And when she drove back down the same road weeks later, the lot was empty, just a cracked foundation overrun by weeds, as though the station had been abandoned for years.
Story number 7.
Jenny was a new night nurse at St. Mark's, a crumbling hospital on the outskirts of town. The pay was decent, and the shifts were quiet, too quiet. Most of the hospital's patients were elderly or terminal, and the upper floors of the building were shut down years ago due to budget cuts. Yet, every so often, Jenny would hear strange noises coming from above. Faint footsteps, the low creak of something heavy shifting, or, worst of all, muffled voices. The other nurses shrugged it off. "This place is old," one of them said. "The pipes groan. The wind gets in through cracks. Don't think too much about it." But Jenny wasn't convinced, especially after her first incident. It was just after 2 a.m. when the call light for room 412 flicked on. The patients in the wing were mostly asleep by that hour, and room 412 was empty. Jenny hesitated for a moment before heading down the dimly lit hallway. The door to 41212 stood ajar, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. When she stepped inside, the room was cold, unnaturally so. She checked the thermostat on the wall, broken, of course. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling foolish. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the IV pole tucked against the wall. Jenny turned to leave, but as she reached the door, the call light flicked on again. Her heart thudded in her chest. She stepped back toward the panel and pressed the reset button. The light blinked off. She exhaled, shook her head, and left. But as she walked down the hall, she felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like she was being watched. She glanced back. The door to room 412 was wide open, though she had just closed it. This time, Jenny didn't go back. She told herself it was a wiring issue and reported it to maintenance the next morning. They claimed everything was in working order. The next few nights were uneventful, and Jenny began to feel silly for being spooked, until the elevator came. She was at the nurse's station reviewing charts when the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. It was odd, considering no one else was supposed to be on the floor. She glanced at the monitor showing the elevator's feed. The doors slid open, but the car was empty. Jenny watched, uneasy, as the elevator sat idle for a moment, then closed and began ascending to the 5th floor. Her stomach tightened. The 5th floor was closed, its doors locked, its patients long gone. A wave of dread washed over her. She picked up the phone and called security. "Hey, is someone messing around on the 5th floor?" The guard sounded bored. "5th floor? No, nobody's up there." "Well, the elevator just went up," she said, her voice shaking. The guard sighed. "I'll check it out." Minutes later, he called back. "No one's up there. Elevator's empty too. It's probably a glitch." Jenny hung up, unconvinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The elevator dinged again, this time stopping on her floor. The doors slid open, and a cold breeze swept through the hall. Again, it was empty. Jenny stared at it, her instincts screaming for her to leave, but something compelled her to step closer. She looked inside and saw it, a single handprint on the mirror at the back of the car. A child's handprint. That night, she refused to take the elevator. The final straw came a week later. She was alone, making her rounds when she heard it, laughter. It was faint, high-pitched, and echoing down the hall. She froze, straining her ears. The laughter came again, this time accompanied by light, running footsteps. She followed the sound, her heart pounding. It led her to the stairwell. The heavy door creaked as she pushed it open. The stairs spiraled up into darkness, the faint sound of a child's giggle drifting from above. "Hello?" Jenny called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The giggling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sound of feet rushing down the stairs. Jenny backed away, her hand trembling on the door. She caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure, barely visible in the dim light. It stopped at the landing, just out of reach of the emergency light. "Come play," the child whispered. The voice was distorted, wrong. Jenny slammed the door and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the parking lot. She quit the next morning, leaving without explanation. Months later, she learned the truth. Decades ago, a fire had broken out on the 5th floor, killing several patients and staff. Among the dead was a little girl who had been left behind in the chaos. She was found clutching a singed doll, her tiny body curled in the corner of the stairwell. No one ever worked the night shift alone again.
Story number 8.
Caleb took the night security job at the old Darrow Mill because he needed the money. The mill had been shut down for decades, a hulking relic of the town's once thriving textile industry. Now it was little more than a decaying building surrounded by overgrown fields, its machinery long rusted and silent. His job was simple: sit in the tiny security booth at the entrance and patrol the premises twice a night. The owner, a developer planning to renovate the property, warned Caleb about vandals and squatters but assured him the place was otherwise harmless. That first night, Caleb doubted his decision. The air inside the mill was heavy with dust, the kind that clung to your throat and made your eyes itch. His flashlight barely cut through the darkness, the narrow beam revealing glimpses of crumbling walls, piles of debris, and the occasional scurrying rat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind through broken windows. He finished his first patrol quickly and returned to the booth, relieved to be out of the eerie building. But just after midnight, the monitors flickered. The CCTV cameras installed around the mill displayed grainy black and white footage of empty halls and machinery. Caleb frowned as the screen for camera 3 blinked. For a split second, it showed static, then returned. But something was different. In the corner of the frame, near an old loom, stood a figure. It was barely visible, just a shadowy outline, but it was unmistakably a person. Caleb's heart raced. The owner had warned him about squatters, but how could someone have slipped past him? He grabbed his flashlight and baton, his palms slick with sweat, and headed back into the mill. The air inside felt colder this time. He followed the path to the loom, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. When he reached camera 3's location, the area was empty. No sign of anyone. "Hello?" Caleb called out, his voice shaky. "You're trespassing. You need to leave." No response. The only sound was the faint creak of the building settling. He stood there for a moment, the flashlight trembling in his hand, before deciding to head back. But as he turned to leave, he saw it. On the far wall, smeared in what looked like rust, were 3 words: "We never left." Caleb stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He swung his flashlight wildly, searching for any sign of movement, but the room was empty. When he returned to the booth, his hands were shaking too much to hold his coffee cup. He stared at the monitors, watching for any sign of the figure. Hours passed, and the screens remained still. Caleb convinced himself it had been his imagination. Dust in the air, shadows playing tricks on him. The second patrol was worse. This time, he heard it. Soft at first, then louder, the rhythmic clatter of machinery as if the mill had come back to life. He followed the sound, his flashlight flickering. The noise grew louder the closer he got to the main weaving room, the heart of the mill where dozens of looms once worked in unison. When he pushed the door open, the sound stopped. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the smell of burnt fabric. Caleb's flashlight illuminated the rows of silent looms, their metal frames coated in years of grime. On one of the machines, the threads had been freshly strung, weaving a pattern that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. And then he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the room, her back to him. She wore a tattered dress, her hair matted and falling in uneven strands. Caleb froze, his voice catching in his throat. "Ma'am," he finally managed, "you're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. Slowly he stepped closer, gripping his baton tightly. "I said you need to leave." The woman turned, and Caleb's blood ran cold. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. Her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and she let out a guttural scream that echoed through the mill. Caleb turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. The scream followed him, growing louder, filling his head until he thought his skull would split. He burst out into the night air, his lungs burning, and didn't stop running until he reached his car. He quit the next day, refusing to return even to collect his last paycheck. Weeks later, the mill was demolished. Caleb hoped that would be the end of it. But the nightmares began soon after. In his dreams, he was back in the weaving room, surrounded by looms that worked on their own, the threads forming words he couldn't read. The woman would appear, her hollow eyes boring into his soul, her scream filling his mind. And then, one morning, Caleb woke to find 3 words scratched into the wall above his bed. "We never left."
Story number 9.
Martin had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and superstitions were nothing but a waste of time to him. So when he was offered the job of night janitor at the abandoned Hollow Creek Asylum, he accepted without hesitation. The pay was good, and he figured the spooky reputation of the place was just an exaggeration. The asylum had been closed for decades after a scandal involving mistreatment and mysterious deaths of patients. Over time, it became a local legend, a place teenagers dared each other to enter, a spot where people claimed to hear voices and see shadows. But to Martin, it was just another building in need of cleaning. His first night was uneventful, albeit eerie. The long, empty hallways stretched into darkness, their walls lined with peeling paint and broken tiles. The flickering fluorescent lights cast unsettling shadows, and the occasional creak of the old building settling made his nerves hum, but he shrugged it off. It was on his second night that things began to happen. He was mopping the floor near the old patient records room when he heard it. A faint giggle. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, and it echoed softly down the hallway. Martin stopped, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. No answer. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Must be the wind." He went back to mopping, but the sound came again. Closer this time, a giggle, followed by the faint patter of footsteps. Martin abandoned the mop and walked toward the source of the noise. His flashlight beam danced along the walls, illuminating nothing but cracked plaster and scattered debris. He reached the end of the hall where a large metal door stood slightly ajar. This was the old children's ward. Pushing the door open, Martin stepped inside. The room was cavernous, its far corners swallowed by darkness. Rows of rusted beds lined the walls, their frames covered in cobwebs. Toys lay scattered across the floor, coated in dust. As Martin swept his flashlight over the room, he noticed something odd. One of the beds had no dust on it. The sheets were wrinkled as if someone had just gotten up. On the pillow lay a small, weathered teddy bear. The giggle came again, loud and clear, and Martin's flashlight flickered. He spun around, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Play with me." Martin stumbled back, his breath visible in the freezing air. The flashlight flickered once more and then went out completely. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking, when he heard the sound of a ball bouncing. Thud, thud, thud. The sound grew louder, echoing through the room. In the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the broken windows, Martin saw it, a red ball rolling toward him, stopping just inches from his feet. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, heart hammering, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. Then he felt it, a tiny hand gripping his own. Martin screamed, jerking his hand away. His flashlight flickered back to life, and for a brief second, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, stood before him. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow black pits, and her lips stretched into a wide, unnatural smile. "Don't leave," she whispered, tilting her head unnaturally to the side. "Stay and play." Martin didn't think twice. He bolted for the door, slamming his shoulder into it until it finally gave way. He ran down the hallway, the sound of laughter chasing him. As he reached the exit, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The little girl stood at the end of the hall, her hand clutching the teddy bear, her black eyes glinting in the darkness. And just as he pushed the door open, she raised her free hand and waved. Martin quit that night. He told no one what he'd seen, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't escaped entirely. A week later, as he was unpacking a box in his apartment, he found something that didn't belong to him. Sitting at the bottom of the box was a dusty, weathered teddy bear. And faintly, just behind him, he heard the sound of a ball bouncing. Thud, thud.